Well, I think it's an important point to point out that as we talk about everyday ethnicity, really ethnography is kind of the lifeblood of everyday ethnicity studies. And it's one of those things that in order to sort of understand how non-elite sources, non-elite people, everyday people sort of practice their life, you need ethnographic observations, you need to go talk to people. It's hard to do that kind of study institutionally. So it was really important that ethnographic focus take primary methodological approach for me. In terms of doing ethnographic work in China, I think there is always going to be, as you say, the promise and the peril. You get wonderful, rich accounts from just going out and talking to people. So you can't replicate that kind of data as much as we might want to, as much as we might like to try. There is really no substitute for going straight to people where they are and talking to them and hearing their experiences. And so, the conversations that I had were immensely rewarding, and the conversations that I had that lasted, some of them hours, with my respondents. I learned all kinds of things from just listening to people talk about their lives. For example, as a consequence of the sort of urban transformation focus of the project, I got to learn a lot about the cities that I was working in, their recent histories, how they had changed. I have a very strong memory of talking with a restaurant owner in Jinan who had been born in the 1950s, and he was talking about how the city itself had sort of massively changed in the last even 30 years. And it was this revealing portrait of a city that I thought that I knew really well. And then I figured out as he continued to talk about it that there was this whole period that completely had transformed the city that I knew nothing about. So that's a reward, certainly. But there are also hindrances and perils. First of all, it's really hard if you are going out and trying to get interviews. There's always, no matter where you do it, no matter what situation you find yourself in, it's hard to earn trust of people that you want to interview. And that's true in basically any circumstance. So it's a lot of investment in building relationships and headaches with scheduling and making sure that you're in the right place at the right time. And sometimes you just have to go with opportunities that present themselves to you. It's not always easy to sort of embrace the sort of chaos of sometimes of an interview that goes off the rails, but sometimes an interview that leads you to a surprising corner will be beneficial. I think the other peril that you add, or the difficulty that you add sometimes in China, is that there is a state presence that is sort of hard to navigate around. There's a political scientist named Sarah Turner who talks about you're always doing work in the footsteps of the state in an authoritarian state. And so you always have to be aware that protecting people who speak to you from sort of observation or that kind of thing is something that you need to be wary of. So I think you have to sort of balance getting the rich data that you are seeking with the responsibility to make sure that there are not repercussions for someone who talks to you from an organ of the state.
This is kind of a follow-up, but beyond the political dimension, being an ethnographer who was neither Han nor Hui, how did that positionality, how is being who you are, how do you think that shaped your experience in the field as an ethnographer? And did it have any impact on your own understanding of who you are?
Absolutely. And I would also add not only not Han, not Hui, but non-Muslim as well. It's a
right
sort of barrier between myself and most of the people that I was interviewing and talking to. One of the difficulties, I think, in terms of establishing positionality as someone who is thoroughly an outsider to the communities that you work in is building up an understanding of your intentions and what you are interested in. And I think for many of my respondents, there was a bit of a curiosity about why I would care about everyday Hui practices. I think there was also sort of an issue in my case, because lots of people study Hui communities for theology and for more orthodox sort of religious practice, ritual, and things like that. And these were not necessarily the kinds of things that I was asking about. I wasn't necessarily looking into intellectual history or tradition, which are sort of the more usual subjects that I think people tend to ask about. And so there was a bit of conversation about well, if you're not here to study Islamic theology, if you're not here to study ritual and intellectual history, then what do you want to know? And why are you so interested in things like, daily consumer practices, or, what the standards are for halal certification, or all of these sorts of issues that came up in the book. So sort of communicating your objective is something that really makes you think about what are you doing in the field, and then also just sort of how you fit as a researcher into this practice of doing study, doing observation. You have to be very clear with your intentions. And sometimes as a person who is not from the same ethnic or religious tradition, there is some curiosity that you have to satisfy there. So I think, just the process of communicating openly and honestly with people that I talked to was certainly something that made me think through not only what I was doing in the field, but also my own position as a non-native, non-Muslim researcher in these communities.
Could you expand a little bit empirically on the everyday kind of ethnic politics that you explore in the book? Both the ethnic politics between the majority Han and the minority Hui, but also there's a lot of very rich empirical material about different groups of Hui and how they interact and how those interactions shape different Hui identities. So I don't know, those two different empirical categories, if you could speak just a little bit on each of them.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I expected to find when I went into the field to do my research was that, maybe some of the large-scale changes in urban environments might heighten the awareness of difference between Han and Hui, or it might, make those divisions more salient or more present in everyone's everyday lives. And what I continually found as I went and talked to people was that actually, the major differentiations, the way that people were talking, the divisions that people were interested in negotiating were all internal. That what the migration of rural Hui to urban settings, or for Western Hui to Eastern communities, a lot of these divisions were drawing lines within the community itself. That really what was being debated was not so much how Hui and Han, sort of existed side by side, but how different expressions of Hui-ness were being expressed. How people brought very different understandings of what it meant to be a part of the Hui community to the table, and that these were being sort of intensified as people from Western places like Gansu or Qinghai, or further afield, came to places like Shandong or Beijing. There were different and competing traditions, different religious sects, and different just orientations, different localized language dialects, all these things. People had these competing ideas of what it meant to be Hui, and a lot of the exchange that was going on was reopening this idea of Hui-ness as a category. So I think one of the most interesting things was you would have people who would make these really equivocal and really emphatic statements that they were doing Hui identity the right way. That especially in the case of how religious practice was observed, for instance, whether or not you were a regular attendee of prayer was a big deal for some of my respondents, who insisted that if you weren't going to the mosque, regularly as a matter of practice, then somehow you were a fallen Hui. My respondents always like to use this word "danhua," or watered down. And so a lot of times, especially out in West China and Xining, where there are a lot of different religious traditions within the Islamic community, you would get people who would insist that the other groups, the people who belong to this different Sufi tradition or this branch of Islam, they were the ones who were danhua, or they were the ones who were watered down. So it was really interesting to see sort of how, when people who had lived in sort of separate communities were coming together in the midst of migration or change, how these debates were reopened.
Could you talk a little bit more about Hanhui relations and how those may or may not have been shaped by CCP ethnic minority policy?
Sure. Yeah, I think Han-Hui relations are an interesting case study for a lot of reasons. There is a history in the not too distant past, in the late Qing dynasty and the early Republican period, of Islamic rebellions in northwest China that have come to really, I think, in the minds of a lot of people, define who the Hui are. And these are often conflicts that began as sort of localized religious conflicts that spill out into larger conflicts. One of my good colleagues, 𝗘𝘃𝗲𝗿𝘃𝗲𝗄, has written a lot about this, about how these rebellions began as these localized affairs and then spill out and encompass entire regions. And the armies of the Qing dynasty, Zhuang Tong, who is famous for inventing General Tso's chicken, would come in and put down these rebellions in this very aggressive and sort of brutal way. And this sort of became how lots of people conceptualized who the Hui were: rebellious and troublemaking. And in some senses, that legacy still pervades a lot of Han-Hui relationships in certain communities, especially in northwest China, where those tensions and those suspicions still linger. And so there does tend to be, especially in cities like Xining, that where a lot of these conflicts were very present, there tends to be a very pervasive separateness between Han and Hui. There are Hui parts of the city that are very clear and very noticeable, and then when you step outside of the Hui part of the city, there are very rarely interactions between Han and Hui outside of them. And so what this does often in places like Xining, also in places like Jinan, which is sort of a different situation, you've got a very majority Han city with a very small Hui community. The interactions are largely rooted in stereotype, and that stereotype is born out of just non-interaction. And so there are occasionally tensions that arise from cultural misunderstandings, and that perpetuates all kinds of sort of low-level tensions that can occasionally balloon into something larger and nastier. In a small sort of suburban village outside of Jinan, once I was walking around and I was seeing this graffiti that was sprayed all over the walls of this small Hui village that read "God is a drug." Sort of a homonym for the phrase in the sort of Islamic tradition, "There is no God but God." In Chinese, it's "Renju Dui," and that had been sort of changed into reading "God is a drug." And the guy who was leading me through the village was saying, this is an act of sort of vandalism by Han people who are from the village across the way, and they're locked in this competition for construction rights in the city or in the sort of suburban area. And so it's sort of ballooned into this aggressive, vandalizing kind of thing, and it sort of ruined relationships between the two communities. So there is that tendency.
Why does all this matter for the Chinese party state? The fact that you might have, for example, different groups of Han and Hui competing over resources, but also engaged in stereotyping one another and potentially also engaging in prejudicial and discriminatory acts and behaviors.
I think it's important for authoritarian governance and authoritarian legitimation narratives. So one thing that is increasingly important in the present day, Jennifer Pan, who is a scholar at Stanford, points out that the current party state is really obsessed in a lot of ways with stability, societal stability as a legitimating concept, that its narratives about legitimation stress that the party is a provider of stability that allows for domestic prosperity. And this includes all kinds of different aspects of daily life. Jennifer Pan calls this seepage, when a concept becomes so important that it sort of overrides a lot of other priorities. And in the case of ethnic politics, stability is really important in terms of having what the party identifies as interethnic cooperation and interethnic harmony. And so all of its narratives sort of center on the idea of equanimity under the party's supervision, that the party is a supervisor of stable ethnic relations. And so, it's important for the party to maintain a climate where there is not ethnic tension, there are not outbreaks of either disruption or violence or what have you between ethnic groups, that it wants to maintain an aura of supervising harmonious ethnic relations. And where that doesn't happen, where there are tensions, it does sort of throw into stark relief the contrast with the legitimating narrative. And so it becomes important to try and manage this and preempt any kind of instability that might happen. James Liebold has written a lot about how, for the most part, the party has been pretty successful in managing its ethnic relations, but where there are failures or where there are breakdowns, they become large, disruptive, and potentially, threatening to larger aims and larger practices.
Great. Could you talk a little bit about how things have changed in the years since you did your field work? Obviously, there's been a lot going on in Xinjiang, and that's quite different from Hui. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the differences, some of the broad differences and similarities between the Hui and Uyghur communities, but more specifically about perhaps the Hui communities that you did your ethnographic research in. What you know about how things have changed since then.
Yeah, so I think in many ways, 2015 and 2016 is an interesting sort of pivot point for how ethnic politics in Islamic communities in China was unfolding. And there's a lot out there about what's happening to Uyghurs in Xinjiang that I'll leave for another conversation, so I can sort of talk a little bit about what happened in my own communities. In 2015, 2016, we were starting to see the establishment of the sort of Belt and Road initiatives throughout China and the connections that were being made to the larger Islamic world, be it the states of the Arab League or Indonesia, Malaysia, other places. And for instance, when you drove from the airport in Yinchuan up to the city center in 2015, along the median of the highway, the lampposts all had banners that were the flags of the different members of the Arab League as you went up the highway. And there was this notion that as the capital of a Hui autonomous region and as a strategic sort of pivot point on the nexus between Central Asia and the Middle East, that Yinchuan would be this fulcrum of China's exchange. There were all kinds of things that were set up to facilitate this. I think it's called the Sino-Arabic Cooperation Affair, or there's an acronym that I can't remember, was hosted annually in Yinchuan. People who lived in the community, especially Hui who lived in the community, were very confident in their ability to be sort of global ambassadors to the Islamic world through outreach. And what's happened in the years since is a really stark reversal where, in 2015, 2016, there was a sense that, the Hui were going to be on a display as a sort of model Islamic minority in China. And in the years since then, there has been a sort of pervasive project of de-Islamification that occurs alongside a general crackdown on Islam in China. And this includes things like taking off of signs the Arabic text. This includes Arab-style mosques, the mosques that are frequently cited as being Arab-style mosques, being Sinicized, being sort of architecturally modified to remove their obvious sort of Arabesque, or as my colleague Ryan Thumb would point out, their Mughal-esque features, to sort of make them appear more in line with a party state approved expression of Islamic identity. And so there is a sense that in Hui communities, Islam and Islamic expression is being sort of curtailed to fit in with pre-approved state forms, and that anything that is heterogeneous or tied to foreign sources is viewed as potentially threatening or in need of alignment with the party state. So it's actually quite a dramatic change from the optimism that was sort of in the air in places like Yinchuan in particular in 2015 to see this very dramatic reversal in the present day.